How a Sect Creates Killers. Part 1. Do you know how sects recruit and create killers? Are you aware that anyone can fall into their web? It could be your child, someone close to you, or even you. Today, there's no longer a need to come into direct contact with them, attend their lectures, or read their literature. All it takes is playing certain video games. We are now facing a situation in which the blending of our everyday reality with the fictional worlds of some video games poses a real threat to our safety and to the safety of our children. It also threatens the national security of our countries. It's important to clarify from the outset. This article in no way seeks to generalize about all video games or portray the entire industry as evil. Nor do we accuse every developer or team involved in creating the games discussed here. Our concern lies in the fact that some video games have become a platform for the activities of adherents of an international totalitarian sect. These individuals were brought in as consultants during development, allowing them to embed informational codes, subliminal programs, and psychological triggers rooted in their extremist ideology. Rick Alan Ross as a consultant on Far Cry 5. One striking example that prompted the investigation behind this article is the 2018 first-person shooter video game, Far Cry 5. While it is not the first installment in the Far Cry adventure series, what makes this particular title noteworthy is the involvement of American anti-cultist and deprogrammer Rick Alan Ross, a known associate of Alexander Dvorkin and a follower of his totalitarian sect. Rick Ross confirmed his involvement via social media. Below are excerpts from an edited transcript of an interview with Far Cry 5 creative director Dan Hay and Rick Alan Ross. We started to talk to Rick Ross about language. The devil is in the details of this stuff. Dan Hay, creative director of Far Cry 5, on the development process of the 5th installment in the Far Cry series. 2 words, free labor, said Rick Alan Ross, Ubisoft's cult consultant for Far Cry 5, in an interview last week at a ranch outside Livermore, California. I was asking about the role the Eden Gates cult plays in the French game maker's March 27th blockbuster for PC, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One, and how Far Cry 5's creative director Dan Hay and his team worked with Ross to make these fanatics feel true to real-world cultists. Dan Hay, creative director of Far Cry 5. We started to talk to Rick Ross about language. The devil is in the details of this stuff. Right away, when we started to talk, we got the sense of just the parlance of the cult needs to be different. There needs to be words they use that we've never heard before. We talked about things like love bombing, really strange terms that, okay, hold on. When we start to write this and build these characters, they need to have a language that's different. It was powerful to be able to grow that. Games beat. How important is it to reach people who might have never even thought about a cult? Or they might just remember the Branch Davidians when they were growing up. What happened there? Ross. I think that cults are ever present. I travel all over the world. It's a phenomenon that's everywhere. It's global. I can assure you that it's a growth industry. There are more destructive cults today than there were back in the 70s or 80s or 90s. It's a very real and current problem. I think the game taps into that, and I think, other than being exciting and fun, it also can pique people's awareness and give them some of the telltale red flags of what would be a cult. Ross. And that's when it gets really scary, as opposed to a cynical con man or manipulator. When the leader truly is a believer, the potential for violence, the meltdown, the intensity, that's when it gets really freaky, really scary. Games beat. Is there a cult active in the United States right now that you'd consider a danger like this? Ross. There are always dangerous cults in every country around the world. There are, of course, groups that are in the media on, really, a daily basis. If you go to cultnews.com or culteducation.com, you can see that there are many groups that have been called cults that are in the news every day. Rick Alan Ross, cult consultant for Ubisoft on Far Cry 5. At first glance, one might wonder, what role does such consulting actually play? On the surface, it provides a convenient way to stay behind the scenes and shield oneself from potential accountability. But the real implications of this supposedly harmless consulting become painfully clear when we look at the tragedy in Waco in 1993, where Rick Ross advised the FBI and ATF and played a direct role in the tragic outcome. The portalactfiles.org has repeatedly examined the causes and consequences of the Waco tragedy. The facts and circumstances are detailed in the following materials. Among others, crimes of anti-cultism, the Waco siege, how the group of Americans, the Branch Davidians, were demonized and killed. Part 1. The Waco siege, how anti-cultists manipulated media and officials to organize a Holocaust in Texas. Part 2. The Impact, Episode 9, Waco, the Reason of Tragedy, No One Ever Spoke of. The Impact, groundbreaking documentary. To better understand the information that follows in this article, let us briefly recall the events surrounding the Waco tragedy, Rick Ross's role in the demonization campaign against the Branch Davidians, and his involvement as a consultant to FBI and ATF agents before and during the assault on Mount Carmel in Waco, the residence of this peaceful religious group. Rick Allen Ross as a consultant before and during the tragic events in Waco. It all began 6 years before the tragedy, in 1987, when Rick Ross carried out a forced deprogramming of 2 American citizens who were members of the Branch Davidians in upstate New York. In 1988, Ross and other members of the Cult Awareness Network, CAN, launched an active campaign to dismantle the Branch Davidian group and discredit its leader, David Koresh. They began by seeking out defectors and candidates to pose as fake victims. The disinformation and discrediting campaign they initiated against this peaceful religious community spread through the media and was directed at government authorities and law enforcement agencies, claiming that David Koresh and the Branch Davidians posed a serious threat. In 1992, Rick Ross abducted and forcibly deprogrammed Davidian member David Block, an American citizen. During the deprogramming process, which involved both physical and psychological abuse, Ross extracted information from Block about weapons allegedly stored at Mount Carmel. He then passed this information to the ATF, with whom he had personal connections. Although the information about the weapons turned out to be inaccurate and distorted, and David Block was the sole, highly questionable source, having undergone an illegal and coercive deprogramming process, the ATF relied on this information during its investigation. This is confirmed by the U.S. Department of the Treasury's 1993 report on the ATF raid. Long before the tragedy unfolded, Ross's associates were feeding law enforcement agencies slanderous and distorted information. Starting in 1990, they ramped up efforts year after year to discredit and demonize the followers of the Branch Davidians. The pressure they created ultimately escalated into an armed crackdown and the destruction of this religious group by FBI agents, who had been conditioned to see them through the lens of artificial demonization. In addition to the one-sided, distorted information passed along by anti-cultists to the media and to FBI and ATF specialists, there was another perspective, presented in a video recording made by the Davidians themselves during the siege inside Mount Carmel. This footage clearly showed that they were not hostages of David Koresh, but free individuals, ordinary American citizens peacefully practicing their faith without breaking the law. Yet the agents never released this video to the press. A deliberate decision was made not to humanize the people inside. Instead, the image promoted by Rick Ross and his associates was preserved. Crazy cultists preparing for the next Jonestown. The video showed small children, teenagers, and adults, but all of them were stripped of their identities and reduced to faceless cultists, no longer regarded as human beings thanks to Rick Ross's narrative. This is a typical tactic used by anti-cultists, adherents of the only truly existing totalitarian sect, led by Alexander Dvorkin. For decades, they have applied this method to any group or individual they seek to discredit and suppress. Ross's close collaboration with the FBI and ATF is confirmed by documented FBI interrogation transcripts. Among all individuals labeled as cult experts, Rick Ross had the most extensive access to both agencies. An FBI report from one of the interviews notes that Ross harbors a personal hatred toward all religious cults and is eager to assist law enforcement in efforts to destroy the cult. As a result of the Waco tragedy in 1993, 86 American citizens were shot, gassed, and burned, some alive, including elderly people, pregnant women, and 25 children, among them infants and toddlers under the age of 3. The events at Waco resembled a torture chamber created for the people trapped inside by a deranged madman. This is a well-known national tragedy, an instance where Americans, in the form of the FBI, killed other Americans after consulting with and extensively collaborating with a self-proclaimed expert, a supposed cult fighter, who, in reality, is a follower of the only truly existing destructive cult in the world today. If not for the prolonged and initial involvement of so-called anti-cult consultants in this case, the tragedy likely would never have happened. On Rick Ross's own website, culteducation.com, he states, 1993, advised both Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, BATF, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, regarding the Waco Davidians. Rick Ross downplays his involvement, describing it simply as having advised. But is that really the case? Or was he a spotter who used the hands of American federal agents to kill 86 American citizens? To answer that question, let's consider the situation from another angle. Who is the person who presses the launch button, activates a missile system, and fires a rocket into a crowd that includes 25 children and 61 adults? Is this person a killer, someone who pressed the button, deliberately calculated everything, and ensured the rocket hits the target? Or is he merely an operator, a spotter who launched the system, while the missile, not he, did the killing? Another example. A person approaches someone from behind, pulls out a pistol, aims at the back of their head, and pulls the trigger. The bullet pierces the victim's skull and kills them. Who is the killer here? The person who planned the operation and carried it out to its lethal conclusion, or the bullet that struck the intended victim? And how would the families of the deceased answer those questions? Their mothers and fathers, their children, brothers and sisters. These scenarios mirror the Waco tragedy, where 25 children and 61 adults lost their lives. This is exactly how these so-called cult fighters operate. They are followers of Alexander Dvorkin's Totalitarian Sect, a network of sadists, killers, and fanatics. Long before the tragedy, Rick Ross had calculated and orchestrated a multi-stage operation. It began with the systematic dehumanization of his chosen target, the Branch Davidians, and ended in their ruthless annihilation, using federal agents as his instruments of execution. Through a campaign of slander, discrediting, deliberate lies, and a series of information terrorism attacks in the media against the Davidians, Ross's campaign incited escalating hostility from FBI and ATF agents toward a peaceful religious group made up of American citizens. This Christian offshoot had peacefully existed for decades, living in harmony with society, abiding by the law, and never regarded as a cult, until Rick Ross launched his campaign of demonization. The violent liquidation that followed resembled a slow-motion torture session, unfolding in the midst of a premeditated and skillfully manipulated mass hysteria. Thus, it can be stated with confidence that the murder of American citizens, including children and the elderly, was deliberately orchestrated by Rick Ross and his associates, the real perpetrators behind these deaths. Yet to this day, Rick Ross has faced no consequences, no punishment for the deaths of 86 people. He has not been held accountable for using U.S. federal agents as instruments of mass murder, right before the eyes of the entire nation and the world. He remains a free man, a criminal who is, in reality, the true culprit behind this tragedy. It is important to note that the leader of the totalitarian organization to which Rick Ross belongs, Alexander Dvorkin, is likewise responsible for the deaths of innocent people in multiple countries, including many Russian citizens. Much like Rick Ross, Dvorkin uses government agencies in Russia to kill innocent people. This is an international totalitarian sect of killers, sadists, and maniacs who have been orchestrating murder by proxy for more than 3 decades. On the portal actfiles.org, you will find more documented, factual information about numerous tragedies that resulted in the deaths of innocent people at the hands of this totalitarian, misanthropic sect led by Alexander Dvorkin. Returning to Rick Ross, a critical question arises. If one man was able to manipulate seasoned professionals, intelligence agents, law enforcement officers, and government officials, what could he do to the minds of children, teenagers, and unprepared adults who, during gameplay, enter a highly suggestible mental state due to heightened neural excitability and sensory overload. During gameplay, a person becomes fully receptive to the psychological messaging and subliminal programming embedded in these games. We will return to this issue in more detail later in the article. David Koresh, one of the sources of inspiration behind the cult leader character in video games. The Waco tragedy is still regarded by adherents of Alexander Dvorkin's Totalitarian Sect as their triumph, a benchmark, and one of their most successful operations. It comes as no surprise, then, that the demonized image of Branch Davidian leader David Koresh, crafted by Rick Ross and his associates, was used as an inspiration for the fictional cult leader Joseph Seed in the video game Far Cry 5, a project in which Rick Ross was actively involved. Interestingly, David Koresh also served as a source of inspiration for another video game released in 2021, Outriders, in which a fictional cult leader named Salem Koresh was created. Collaboration between Rick Allen Ross and Alexander Dvorkin at conferences, and their connection through FECRIS-affiliated organizations. When discussing Alexander Dvorkin's Totalitarian Sect, it is only fair to present facts about his collaboration with Rick Ross. On Rick Ross's website, there is information confirming his and Alexander Dvorkin's joint participation in an anti-cult symposium held in Thailand. Both are listed as speakers at a 3-day international symposium on cult studies, which took place in Bangkok in 2011. That year marked Dvorkin's third year serving as vice president of FECRIS. Just imagine, members of the world's most dangerous real-life totalitarian cult hide behind the guise of anti-cult activism, giving lectures around the globe, proclaiming themselves experts, organizing symposiums and conferences, all while grooming future victims and new recruits for their own sect. Let us also recall that Rick Ross, in his criminal past as a deprogrammer, was closely connected with CAN, Cult Awareness Network, whose members aided him in the demonization of the Branch Davidians. In the early 1970s, one CAN affiliate was AFF, American Family Foundation, which since 2004 has been known as ICSA and has become a FECRIS affiliate. Alexander Dvorkin has served as vice president of FECRIS since 2009. On FECRIS's official website under the links section, both ICSA and the websites of American anti-cultists Stephen Hessen, Ross's colleague, and Rick Ross himself are listed. While Rick Ross's formal membership in FECRIS has never been publicly confirmed, the link to his website on their page and his participation in international conferences alongside FECRIS members speak for themselves. When one examines the complete list of FECRIS-affiliated links and analyzes their shared ideology, terminology, and identical methodology, any question about their collaboration becomes moot. Earlier, the portal actfiles.org published an article titled Centralized International Anti-Cult Network of Agents, led by Alexander Dvorkin. This article provides a detailed account of the connections between adherents of Alexander Dvorkin's Totalitarian Sect, both with one another and directly with Dvorkin himself. With that background in mind, let's revisit the example of Far Cry 5. Examples of Far Cry 5's influence on players' consciousness. The most compelling evidence comes from the players themselves to demonstrate the harmful influence of embedded elements present in the details of Far Cry 5. Elements that instill specific behavioral cues and psychological directives in players' minds. These examples were found in user comments under various videos related to Far Cry 5, as well as in discussion threads across different online platforms. The first such comments, in which players reported sensing a certain psychological influence, appeared under videos on the official Ubisoft YouTube channel, the developer and publisher of Far Cry 5. Notably, they were posted beneath a video featuring an interview with Rick Ross. Comments under this video. The following comment under the video appears to be written by someone clearly familiar with the Waco incident, or more precisely, with the perspective promoted by Rick Ross and his anti-cult associates. The comment reflects a desire to see a similar Waco-like scenario unfold within the game. This suggests that the extremist, terrorist ideology of Alexander Dvorkin's Totalitarian Sect and of his follower Rick Ross may be deeply embedded in this commenter's subconscious. The next comment, found under a different video, illustrates a dangerous blurring of reality and the fictional world of Far Cry 5 in the viewer's perception. Only you. Various Far Cry 5 video reviews allow viewers to observe the game from the inside without actually playing it. Below is a screenshot showing a frame from the game. The text in the top left corner reads, "Only you. Kill the final target before time runs out." On the wall, "Sacrifice." The phrase "only you" is repeated throughout the game, spoken by characters and embedded in the musical score. The classic song by the Platters, "Only You and You Alone," plays multiple times, and within the narrative, it is used to trigger an altered state of consciousness in the fictional characters. It overrides their will, hypnotizes them, and puts them in a trance. At one point in the game, the player is instructed, while a countdown timer is running and the song "Only You" plays, to quickly navigate dark corridors and shoot down every cultist encountered along the way. It's important to highlight that this killing of cultists under a time constraint is no accident. The player's attention is hyper-focused in that moment, sharpened by the conditions of gameplay, limited time, a specific goal, kill the cultist, and a confined, dimly lit path. Simultaneously, the game subjects the player to ongoing audiovisual stimulation. With the repeated use of the song "Only You" and the on-screen message shown in the upper left corner, as illustrated in the image above, additional background cues, such as writing on the walls, slip directly into the subconscious. Due to the player's narrowed focus on completing the task, these peripheral elements bypass conscious processing and imprint directly onto the subconscious. None of these foreign elements are accidental. Every detail of the game is meticulously crafted, and together they form precise directives that penetrate deep into the player's subconscious. One is reminded of the words of Far Cry 5 creative director Dan Hay, speaking about the game's development in collaboration with Rick Ross. "The devil is in the details of this stuff." This is a textbook example of audiovisual influence on the human subconscious. A deeper examination of this kind of subconscious audiovisual encoding was previously discussed in the article "Execute Not Pardon. Where Should the Comma Be Put?" published on actfiles.org. This puzzle coding is a psychological mechanism designed to create future killers and provoke shootings executed by someone else's hands. Through visual and auditory stimuli, manipulators, namely the proponents of anti-cult ideology, subtly and, at first glance, imperceptibly influence both the consciousness and subconsciousness of individuals, altering their worldview and shaping their future behavior. This type of audiovisual encoding can be embedded in films, various videos, and, as in this case, video games. In the case of puzzle coding, background imagery contains hidden neurocognitive triggers and subliminal commands, even if the content appears disjointed or chaotic on the surface. These triggers and commands are designed to activate later under specific external conditions, leading to the execution of a psychological program implanted deep within the individual's subconscious. We will examine what kinds of external conditions might serve as the final stage of activation for such programming further in the article. For now, let us return to the song "Only You and You Alone." Let us highlight the game's ending, which sparked particularly mixed reactions among players. According to the plot, the player is given two choices: either resist the encountered cultists, in which case the game ends with nuclear explosions that annihilate civilization, or choose simply to walk away, leaving with allies. However, in the second scenario, the song "Only You and You Alone" begins playing on the radio, triggering the player character to attack their allies, and the bloodshed continues regardless. As established earlier in the storyline, this song is used to override the will of fictional characters, hypnotize them, place them in a trance, and recruit them into the cult. What is especially noteworthy is that the psychological impact of the song "Only You," adapted for Far Cry 5, has been observed not in fictional characters, but in real players. This has been noted by users themselves. One described the psychological state they entered after hearing the song as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Others left comments expressing a sudden urge to kill, while some reported experiencing real physical tension. What you see here are the direct consequences of actions by individuals like Rick Ross and Alexander Dvorkin, and others from their totalitarian organization. These are clear, visible results of their obsessive drive to create an army of killers. When such manipulators take mentally sound, reasonable people and turn them into future-controlled murderers and maniacs, when these victims are later driven to kill, becoming the instruments of their handlers. These manipulators appear to take satisfaction in the outcomes they engineer and see themselves as gods. This is, without exaggeration, the most terrifying real-life totalitarian sect of sadists, maniacs, and killers, led by Alexander Dvorkin. The video game Doom, the Columbine school shooting, and the connection to Waco. When discussing first-person shooter games, it is important to recall Doom. Often referred to as the father of first-person shooters, it is considered one of the most influential titles in the genre. It was this game that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were obsessed with before they went on to kill 12 students and 1 teacher, injure 23 others, and then take their own lives at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. Doom is so burned into my head, my thoughts usually have something to do with the game. Eric Harris. It is also important to note that the Columbine High School massacre has a direct connection to the Waco tragedy. The shooting was initially planned by the teens for April 19, 1999, the 6th anniversary of the end of the Waco siege and the 4th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. However, they postponed it to April 20th only because they needed more ammunition. It's worth recalling that the deadly Oklahoma City bombing was itself linked to the Waco events. It was carried out on the 2nd anniversary of the tragedy, April 19, 1995. The perpetrator of the Oklahoma City bombing stated that his actions were revenge against the federal government for its crimes, including those committed during the Waco siege. In essence, the tragic deaths of members of the stigmatized religious group, the Branch Davidians, on April 19, 1993, served as the trigger for the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995. A few years later, both of these events became the precedent for the Columbine school shooting on April 20, 1999. What served as the primary trigger in this school massacre, and what played a secondary role, the tragedies instigated by anti-cultists or the influence of computer games, is a question best left to qualified specialists. However, in the case of Far Cry 5, we see that for anti-cult operatives, adherents of Alexander Dvorkin's totalitarian sect, neither is off limits. Neither participation in events now remembered as profound human tragedies with innocent victims, nor involvement in the creation of first-person shooter video games infused with their extremist terrorist ideology designed to shape future-controlled killers. Thus, the responsibility for all the victims mentioned in connection with the tragedies outlined in this article, all of these killings, rests entirely with Rick Ross, the other cultists, and Alexander Dvorkin himself, who founded and leads this totalitarian sect built on an extremist ideology. These are the true killers and maniacs, individuals who take pleasure in executing carefully planned tactical operations designed to produce deadly outcomes, or who simply have others do the killing for them. They appear to derive a sense of power from manipulating the fate of others over human lives. How many lone wolves have they already created? Individuals unleashed to tear apart the innocent, driven by commands that seem invisible at first glance. And how many more will they create? How much more innocent blood must be shed before this dangerous international totalitarian sect of Dvorkin is stopped? How many more children must die? You can't help but ask, what must it feel like for the parents whose children became victims of these spotters, these consultants, who were just offering recommendations? Without question, it is a grief beyond words. But what about the parents whose son or daughter was turned into a killer? When they know their child was never a murderer, was a good student, had dreams, showed promise, and was a kind, decent person, and yet, in one moment, the influence of Dvorkin's totalitarian sect turned their child into a controlled weapon. And it doesn't matter how it happened, whether remotely through video games, media, television, books, or directly through lectures in schools and universities. Over the decades, Alexander Dvorkin's adherents have developed many tools for manipulating and controlling human consciousness, and all of this has one purpose: so they can feel superior to others, feel like gods presiding over innocent human lives, including the lives of children. That is the real reason. And the real killers are not the children, those who fell victim to puzzle coding and deep psychological conditioning. The real killers are the maniacs behind it. The children became victims too, powerless instruments of murder in the hands of these manipulators. All of these facts are not coincidental. They are evidence of a delayed action influence, a documented process of shaping potential killers, and a real-world example of puzzle coding. The information presented above fully proves that puzzle coding is not only real, but actively used by agents of so-called anti-cultism. Those who claim to fight cults, but are, in fact, the true cultists of Alexander Dvorkin, systematically building an army of controlled killers. After such coding, a person needs only a single trigger, such as encountering an article on the internet about cultists, written by Rick Ross, Alexander Dvorkin, or their colleagues, or hearing music like that used in Far Cry 5, to carry out the murder of an innocent person who simply crossed their path. This is why the sect created by Alexander Dvorkin is the most dangerous extremist cult in the world today. The influence of first-person shooter games on the human brain. Since Far Cry 5 is a first-person shooter, it is essential to consider how such games, in general, impact the human brain, regardless of whether they contain puzzle coding. In these games, players immerse themselves in a virtual world through a first-person perspective, which directly affects perception and cognitive processes. The brain processes this kind of gameplay similarly to real-life experiences, particularly in terms of attention and spatial awareness. This perspective significantly enhances a player's sense of spatial presence, the feeling of actually being in the pseudo-reality of the game. Studies show that this phenomenon is linked to increased activity in the frontal and parietal cortices, areas of the brain involved in perception and decision-making. Specifically, the study Perspective and Agency during video gaming influences spatial presence experience and brain activation patterns, confirms that first-person perspective in video games intensifies the sense of reality, while simultaneously reducing alpha wave activity in the corresponding regions of the brain. Intensive first-person gaming can lead to long-term changes in the brain, particularly in regions associated with memory and spatial orientation. Another study, Long-Lasting Connectivity Changes Induced by Intensive First-Person Shooter Gaming, demonstrated that prolonged gameplay results in altered connectivity between the thalamus and the parahippocampal gyrus, changes that were still detectable 3 months later. The paper, Games on the Brain, can take virtual experiences to real-world notes that some players, especially those who game frequently, may experience what are known as game transfer phenomena. These are temporary effects in which players perceive elements from the game in real life, or feel impulses to act as they would in the game. While researchers state that the phenomenon is temporary and eventually subsides on its own, they also observe that many gamers can experience it repeatedly. In other words, for a certain period, the boundary between game and reality becomes blurred. The psychological state that a person may experience during such episodes is described in the aforementioned study, Games on the Brain Can Take Virtual Experiences to Real World. Below is an excerpt from the paper. Since then, we have published 3 more studies cataloging more than 1,600 gamers' experiences. All had experienced some form of game transfer phenomena in various academic journals. Our findings have shown that some gamers are unable to stop thinking about the game after playing. Expect that something from the game will happen in real life. Display confusion between video game events and real-life events. Have impulses to perform something as in the video game. Have verbal outbursts. Experience voluntary and involuntary behaviors. Researchers note that elements from video games can act as triggers during a real-life occurrence of a new game transfer phenomenon episode. To this day, this phenomenon remains poorly understood, and the full cognitive and psychological consequences it may provoke in individuals have not yet been thoroughly studied. However, it is important to emphasize that the actual threat does not lie in the phenomenon of gaming itself, but rather in its combination with embedded elements of puzzle coding, if such elements are present. This raises a critical question. If such a game transfer event takes place in real life, especially in a game that contains puzzle coding, and the player suddenly feels an urge to act as in the game. What will they do? If the game in question was Far Cry 5, the answer is simple. They will do exactly what the game instructed them to do. Kill cultists. But who, in the player's altered perception, will be the cultist? It will be whoever is pointed out to them by the adherents of Alexander Dvorkin's Totalitarian Sect, self-proclaimed experts, responsible for countless innocent deaths, remote executioners of human lives. Today we see many public figures, political actors, and entire disfavored groups and organizations targeted by Dvorkin and his followers, relentlessly branded with the label cultist. This is a highly alarming trend. We will explore this issue in greater depth in the next section. What is clear is that in recent years, and continuing to this day, a real army of killers is being formed. Alexander Dvorkin's Sleeper Army. It is important to emphasize, sleeper for now, but at any moment ready to be activated by a single coded word, cultist. Conclusion. After everything you've learned, ask yourself this. Does Alexander Dvorkin's totalitarian organization, with its cells spread across the globe, have any right to exist in our world, knowing that it creates both mass murderers and lone wolf killers? Does this terrorist organization have the right to operate when every day of its existence brings not only ruined reputations and destroyed lives, but also someone's death? Do they have the right to exist? Answer that question for yourself. To be continued.